Poštovani gledatelji, povjesničari, ljubitelji povijesti, dobra vam večer. Tko želi udisati miris tek pokošene trave, ako može osjetiti miris benzina na 5. aveniji? Pomislite na kazališta, pomislite na gužvu. Zamislite da hodate ulicom i možete ugledati nekoga koga ne poznajete. Rečenice iz drame The City dobro ilustriraju kakva je bila atmosfera u Sjedinjenim državama koncem 19. stoljeća. Iako su u gradove ulazili i Amerikanci iz provincije, najviše useljenih bilo iz Europe. Između 1870. i 1920. u Sjedinjene Američke Države uselilo se 26 milijuna ljudi. Svi su oni promijenili američki način života i uveli nove običaje. Iako se veliki dio useljenika namjeravao vratiti iz Amerike kući čim dovoljno zaradi, to je od njih 100 učinilo tek 30-ak. Većina useljenika bili su muškarci, uglavnom između 15 i 39 godina. Većina je znala čitati i pisati, ali ne puno više od toga. Useljenici koji su došli iz istočne i jugoistočne Europe, katolici i židovi, strašili su Amerikance koji su ih smatrali manje poželjnima od useljenika iz stare Europe. Woodrow Wilson, budući američki predsjednik, 1902. opisao je useljene iz Austro-Ugarske, Rusije i Italije kao ljude koji nemaju vještina ni energije, koji su bez inicijative ili brzog razmišljanja. O njima večeras govorimo u trećoj povijesti.
Od kraja napoleonskih ratova pa do Prvog svjetskog rata oko 50 milijuna Europljana odlazi preko Atlantika. Bila je to najveća emigracija u povijesti. Također bilo je to i razdoblje velikih seoba i u carskoj Rusiji, kao i na Dalekom istoku. Prva masovna emigracija počinje zbog velike gladi u Irskoj 1845. godine. U tom prvom valu sele se još i Nijemci i Skandinavci, dok drugi veliki val počinje 1880. i traje sve do Velikog rata. U tom valu posebno je važno iseljavanje iz Srednje Europe. Iz Austro-Ugarske tada je otišlo 4.383.000 ljudi, što to područje po broju iseljenih stavlja odmah iza Velike Britanije, Italije i Irske.
Gost treće povijesti je Ulfa Brunnbauer, izvršni direktor Instituta za istočnu i jugoistočnu Europu sveučilišta u Regensburgu. Studij povijesti dr. Brunnbauer upisao je u Grazu točno u godinama kada je završavao hladni rat i kada je istočna Europa prolazila kroz dramatične promjene. Ja vam želim dobru večer.
Dobro večer i od moje strane i hvala za pokanu.
We are going to talk on southeastern Europe, but from a particular angle. At the end of 19th century, southeastern Europe became a major source of immigrants to America, with significant repercussions not only on the region, but also partially on the United States and other overseas countries. So, why that many people, or what became so attractive in the United States at the end of 19th century?
Well, that's obviously one of the most important questions when you're dealing with immigration, to looking into the causes of immigration. What makes people leave, which in many cases is not a very easy decision, and it is not taken light-heartedly. And I think it is still useful to look at immigration from this perspective of the pull and push factors. What made people leave, or what motivated them to go and to look for a perspective somewhere else, abroad, in a foreign country, and why, which reasons are responsible for bringing them into a particular country, in this case mainly the United States. So about 90% of the overseas immigrants from Southeastern Europe went to the United States. First, let's look at the United States. I think the major factor was that the wages in the United States were much higher than in East Central or Southeastern Europe. You could not possibly earn as much as you would in the United States. And even when factoring in the costs of going there, obviously you had to buy a ticket for the steamship, but it still made economically sense. Why couldn't you earn so much money, or that amount of money in Southeastern Europe at that time? I think the main factor is the agricultural crisis that was going on at that time in the late 19th century, and Croatia is a very good example. Croatia was also one of the primary sending regions of immigrants to America. More than 200,000 people in the 15 years from 1899, when statistics start for Croatia, for the Kingdom of Croatia and Slavonia, up to World War I, left, most of them to North America, probably even more because very often the statistics don't count everyone, many people live illegally. So at that time, Croatia experienced a severe agricultural crisis. 85% of the population was still living on farms from farming, but the size of farms was very small, and also farmland was distributed very unequally. So around 50% of the farming population had just around 3 or even less hectares of land, and you could not possibly make out a living at that time from such little land. So very many peasants were indebted. They also had to pay taxes. Then in each generation, the amount of land they farmed got smaller. The population was growing. There was not much in terms of industrialization going on at that time, and therefore immigration became a sensible option.
Veliki emigracijski valovi uvelike su ovisili o ubrzanom tehnološkom napretku, ali i o političkim uvjetima. Naime, u Habsburškoj monarhiji tek je 1857. uvedena opća sloboda putovanja unutar granica države, a 1867. i opća sloboda kretanja, osim u slučaju vojne obveze. Do tada je iseljavanje bilo strogo zabranjeno, s obzirom na to da su dominantne merkantilističke teorije upravo u stanovništvu vidjele snagu pojedine zemlje. Čak je nakon novih reformi iseljavanje bilo na razini od samo nekoliko tisuća godišnje, da bi 1880. zbog velike gospodarske krize broj iseljenih počeo nemilice rasti. S druge strane, od 1840. otvorena je prva redovita prekooceanska parobrodska linija između Liverpoola i Bostona. U sljedećim desetljećima prekooceanski promet ubrzano se razvija, a prednjače britanski Cunard i White Star, te njemački Hamburg Amerika liniji i Norddeutscher Lloyd. Nakon razvoja prometa iz sjevernih i atlantskih luka, početkom stoljeća Cunard i White Star organizirali su linije iz Genove i Napulja, a zatim 1903. godine i iz Trsta i Rijeke.
At that time, Croatia was part of much larger state, Austria-Hungary. Why not, I don't know, moving to Trieste or going to Vienna or maybe going even as far as Prague, but still being much closer to home?
That's really an important and very good question. I think we have to look into it first of all from the point of view of employers in other parts of the Habsburg Empire, and they were not very keen to hire people from the less developed parts of the empire who had no skills. And interestingly, American employers, mainly in mining and in the steel factory, they actually depended on this very cheap labor of immigrants from Southeastern Europe and Eastern Europe, and wages were still much higher. So you earned more as an unskilled worker in a mine in Pennsylvania than you would as an unskilled worker in Bohemia. And probably you would not even find a job in Bohemia at all. So it did make sense, and because of the competition of steamship lines, the costs of the journey to America went down really steeply. So it became affordable. And one of the, I think, most important aspects of migration systems is that they work as like a network. So once the first people go, establish themselves in America, they create a network and support their family members, their friends, their kin, their neighbors from the native villages to come to the US as well, by sending money for tickets, by helping them once they arrive in America, which also reduces the costs, the material costs, but also the psychological costs for migrants.
But what do we know? I mean, you have a small village, I don't know, somewhere in Lika, for instance. Yeah. Where do they learn about the possibility to go to a faraway, I don't know, German or maybe English or French port somewhere, you know, to find a ship?
Interestingly, most of them went through German ports. So this is one of the questions that they also kind of explored in my book. Why didn't they leave from Fiume, which was only some kilometers around, but preferred to go from Bremerhaven or Hamburg? The answer is that it was cheaper and faster. Okay. And then there was also a very well-established network of steamship agents and sub-agents who provided information. This information was probably not always very truthful, but it solicited immigrants. It portrayed America as a country of all opportunities and where people could earn a lot. They described transportation as easygoing, and so there were many ways how people could get information, and not forget about the people who had already gone to the United States. They sent letters, and the letters were one of the most powerful instruments to recruit new migrants. And this was so attractive that a never-ending wave of a stream of migrants from Croatia and also other southeastern European regions went to the US. And was it not for the outbreak of World War I, this would have probably continued for much longer.
Činjenica je da kad pogledamo recimo novinske natpise iz tog kraja, samog kraja 19. i samog početka 20. stoljeća, ta nekakva zapravo a priori stigmatizacija ljudi iz pojedinih dijelova Europe uistinu postoji i zapravo je zastrašujuća. Dakle, izrijekom će vam novinski članci govoriti o ljudima iz pojedinih dijelova Europe za koje smatramo upravo to, da su budalasti, da su neradnici. Dakle, neki najgrozniji zapravo oblici stigmatizacije su već u medijskom diskursu na neki način postojali i prije, odnosno tijekom ulaska tih ljudi.
You mentioned approximately 85% of Croats that were, or people in southeastern Europe that were living as farmers, you know, or on land, not very educated, and you are then talking about a very long trip to reach Bremen or Hamburg at that time. Even today, it's not the cheapest thing to do, let alone to buy a ticket and to board a ship. You know, where did they find money for such a long trip?
Very often the steamship tickets were prepaid by relatives that had already established themselves in America, or very often people got a loan and paid for it. And then the prices were not that high, so it was not a prohibitive price at that moment because there was so much competition, and emigration, transporting immigrants from southeastern Europe, from Eastern Europe, was probably the major business for European steamship companies at that time. And from Bremerhaven it took 10 days or less to New York, and these emigration agencies, they provided a perfectly organized way to come from a village in the Lika to buy from a local agent, which was often some sort of village notable, the tavern keeper, or maybe even the priest, to buy a ticket for the train from Zagreb on to Bremerhaven. Then they were cared for by this migration agency, put on the ship, and in America they were met by their friends or relatives. So it was a big step, but it was not unthinkable, even for people who probably even could not read and write.
Srednjoevropska emigracija, koja počinje 1880-ih, preuzela je već organizirani prijevoznički i posrednički sustav iz prijašnjeg emigracijskog vala. Većina je preko Atlantika kretala iz velikih europskih luka poput Liverpoola, Bremerhavena i Hamburga, a smatra se da je oko polovine svih iseljenika iz hrvatskog primorja odlazilo iz Avra i Šerbura. Takve goleme migracije ljudi omogućila je i ubrzana izgradnja željezničke mreže, tako da potkraj 19. stoljeća putovanje od juga Austro-Ugarske prema sjevernoj Njemačkoj nije više bilo dugo i iscrpljujuće. Iako je Austro-Ugarska kasnila u izgradnji željeznice, ipak su do 1873. i Rijeka i Trst već dobro umreženi, a kao glavna čvorišta unutar monarhije treba izdvojiti Beč, Budimpeštu i Ljubljanu, otkuda se dalje kretalo prema europskim lukama. Od početka 20. stoljeća vrlo važnu ulogu ima Rijeka, preko koje u desetljeću prije Prvog svjetskog rata u Ameriku odlazi gotovo 320.000 iseljenika, a ona je tada po broju ukrcaja bila na 8. mjestu među europskim kontinentalnim lukama.
And what were they thinking about? Were they all dreaming of reaching the Ellis Island and New York, or maybe telling, well, why not California already?
Some really nice descriptions from that time, like Louis Adamich, for example, this famous writer during the interwar period, who also had left Carniola as a boy, basically, and he also felt motivated by those people coming back from America, being dressed up, representing a completely different culture, telling about the success in America. And so these people went, they had a very rough idea what they would do. Their life in America typically was very hard. but they managed to save, they managed to send back a lot of money, which triggered others to come because they saw, well, money is flowing back from America, so obviously you can save something that you would not be able to do in Croatia. And so it became a kind of a self-reproducing mechanism.
What happened eventually? How many of them managed, and why some eventually returned?
There's some data from the US authorities that show that, for example, with respect to Croats and Slovenians, which in the US statistics were counted as one group, that almost 50% of them returned. We don't know how many of these returnees went back to America again. We know from the statistics that many immigrants to America had already been there previously, so maybe the eventual number was smaller. But a significant number of people did return, not only to Croatia, but you see it's also increased, for example. And there are some good descriptions from the interwar period that show that these returnees, they really changed the culture of their native villages. They invested in small business. For example, the hotel industry and the Adriatic was in the interwar period to some part on islands like Brač, which experienced significant overseas immigration. Then returnees came back, invested in hotels, built up the Adriatic tourist industry to some extent, created small banks or other small businesses.
Velika većina emigranata odlazi zbog ekonomskih razloga. Područje Austro-Ugarske 1873. pogodila je velika agrarna kriza, koja je trajala sve do kraja 19. stoljeća. Najteže su pogođeni bili upravo najzaostaliji krajevi, od kojih su neki zbog emigracije gotovo potpuno opustjeli. Uz gospodarsku krizu, među važnije generatore iseljavanja ubrajamo i ukidanje kmetstva, prezaduženost seljaka, raspad kućnih zadruga, nerodne godine i mnoge biljne bolesti. Položaj stanovništva u Dalmaciji i Primorju dodatno je otežavalo i donošenje vinske klauzule 1891. kojom je snižena carina na uvoz talijanskog vina u zemlje monarhije. Uz gospodarske probleme česti razlog iseljavanja bilo i izbjegavanje vojne obveze. Odlazak u Ameriku i mogućnost zarade bili su puno privlačniji od trogodišnjeg služenja vojnog roka, tako da se često događalo da mladići neposredno prije regrutacije misteriozno nestanu, a posebno je velik broj mladića bježao uoči početka Prvog svjetskog rata.
Let's concentrate a little bit on those who have decided to stay or couldn't actually return. For how long have they actually remained Croats or South Slavs or not real Americans when it comes to language education?
Well, I think they became real Americans quickly, but you can be a real American and still be a Croat, which is the good thing about America. So you can be both. You can have this hyphenated identity. But I mean, this question in how far did they retain a Croatian identity or whatever you would like to call it, or some relation to their homeland, I think we have to look at this from the point of view of a dynamic. The Croatian part of the identity, or let's put it the homeland part of the identity, mattered more during different periods of time. During both world wars, for example, you do see a mobilization of Croatian, but also Serbian, Slovenian immigrants who during World War I are mobilized for the unification of Yugoslavia and then for the support of the liberation struggle in World War II. In peacetime, it probably did not matter too much. I mean, it becomes part of a nostalgic memory. The second generation and the third at latest doesn't speak the language anymore, even though especially the first generation of the church tries to maintain language proficiency by running schools, but this is not really relevant. It doesn't help you in America. So this is being lost, but people do remember, and especially in times of stress, in times of crisis in their homeland, even second or third or fourth generation migrants can be mobilized and take action, which is something that we saw also in the 1990s.
Emigracija u Ameriku danas je najaktualniji narodni naš problem, socijalni, politički pa i moralni. Naš svijet, domaći element, hrli slijepo u Ameriku, a pusta ognjišta polako i sigurno zauzima stranac. To je užasna činjenica, danas najsuvremenija i najtragičnija, pred kojom nemoćno stoji naš sociolog, političar i moralist.
Pisma koja stižu, dakle, ta prva pisma hrvatskih Amerikanaca koja stižu su zapravo puno opisa vrlo loših životnih uvjeta. Opisuju se, dakle, oni sami, dakle, da nisu više osobe, nego postoje brojevi koji mehanički odlaze raditi u tvornice i vraćaju se, dakle, u nešto što naravno nije dom, nego je neko puko preživljavanje. Pa onda, dakle, iz te obećane zemlje, dakle, vrlo rano dolaze ti nekakve ideje, dakle, o vraćanju u nešto što je ipak dom, što ipak ima neku emociju sa sobom, neku kulturu, neku toplinu i sve to zapravo oni na neki način gube. Međutim, zanimljivo je vidjeti kada se prvi novci, zapravo, kada se financijski nekakvi benefiti njihovog odlaska u Ameriku ipak počinju doma slati, kakvi god. Neki zapravo ne uspiju ni to. Ali oni koji odjednom rade veliku stratifikaciju između u matičnim zajednicama.
And what happened with the lands they left? 200,000 in such a short period of time, young people mostly.
When we talk about migration, or in the public debate, we usually, the public and also politics is mainly interested in immigration, in the consequences of immigration. And all the debate is about immigration. And is it good or not? I mean, economists would probably say that in the long run, countries benefit from immigration. But immigration to one country is also emigration from another country. And what are the economic consequences for the emigration? But after all, I think emigration does not really contribute to economic development. It certainly helps to alleviate poverty. It helps the families that are affected. Their living standard grows because migrants tend to send money home to their families. But overall, it might even have negative consequences for descending countries. They lose economic potential, and as you said, it is usually the most entrepreneurial people who leave. It's not the poorest that leave. It's the entrepreneurial people who see that in their home country they cannot realize their dreams. So they go abroad and they contribute then to the economic success of the country wherever they go to. So far there is no really good case for any poor country or underdeveloped country or peripheral country that managed to develop thanks to emigration.
Austria-Hungary at that time, late 19th, beginning of 20th century, was for sure even the poorest parts of Austria-Hungary were better developed than some of the independent countries to the southeast.
Yes.
What are the differences or similarities between migrants from Bulgaria or Romania or Montenegro and Austria-Hungary?
I think this is what makes Southeastern Europe such a good case for comparison, because you have a relatively small region, but very different patterns also in terms of migration. Also because the different parts of Southeastern Europe belong to different states. As you said, the Habsburg monarchy was certainly not the most underdeveloped part of the region, and to some extent development is necessary for migration. You need to have a physical infrastructure to live. Without railways, people from the Lika would not have gone to America, probably. So this is already a difference between, let's say, what then still was Ottoman territory, which was infrastructurally much less developed. And then we also have to look into the rules for immigration, because the state matters also in terms of immigration. States, governments try to control immigration. And for example, Austria, as part of Austria-Hungary, Austria after 1867 had a completely liberal immigration regime. People could leave. This was a constitutional right. It was part of the 1867 constitution, 1867 constitution, the right to emigrate. So the government had not even the right to stop people emigrating. In other countries, like Bulgaria, for example, when in 1906, 1907, overseas immigration kind of was about to begin from Bulgaria in significant numbers, the government actually prohibited it. And it enforced this prohibition.
But at the same time, very many of those who left did not have passports. Many of them entered illegally. What was stopping Bulgarians?
I mean, it was easier to leave illegally, but to enter into the United States illegally was not very easy, because you had to pass through Ellis Island, and these were rather stringent controlled. But for example, the Bulgarians, they simply did not issue passports. The US began to put pressure on transit and on immigration countries to implement their rules of entry already at the point of embarkment.
Okay.
So this is a nice story, basically, because it relates to Croatia. That Fiorella LaGuardia, who is famous not only because an airport in New York is named after him, but who was mayor of New York and also congressman. He was a consular agent in Fiume, in Rijeka. He thought, well, why should we leave all these people go to America and then be medically examined on Ellis Island? And some of them are rejected from entry because they have some medical condition. It would be much better for our government, but also for the migrants, to control them at the place where they get on board. This is on Fiume. And so you see that a sort of transnational policy field emerges where the US already begins to force European countries to implement its own regulation.
Konzularni predstavnici SAD-a u Rijeci djeluju od 1831. ali su tek početkom 20. stoljeća, kada se zbog vala iseljavanja javlja potreba za dobro organiziranom konzularnom službom, u Rijeku počeli stizati profesionalni konzularni namještenici. U veljači 1904. upravo u vrijeme kada je pokrenuta nova direktna linija između Rijeke i New Yorka, na mjesto konzularnog agenta dolazi mladi Fiorello Henry LaGuardia. Glavna mu je dužnost pregled iseljenika koji svaka 2 tjedna odlaze prema New Yorku. Riječki konzulat radio je sve do 1920-ih, a LaGuardia, budući član Američkog kongresa, dugogodišnji gradonačelnik New Yorka i direktor UNRE, u lipnju 1906. odlazi u New York, gdje se još neko vrijeme bavi emigrantima, radeći kao tumač na otoku Ellis.
Iskustvo ljudi koji su dolazili na Ellis Island je uveliko ovisilo o tome iz kojeg dijela doslovce broda ovoga su došli, odnosno ljudi koji su dolazili iz prve i druge klase zapravo nisu uopće prolazili sve te i medicinske preglede, ali sve te nekakve imigracijske postupke koji su zapravo prolazili oni koji su došli iz potpalublja. Što znači da odmah na nekakvom ulazu u tu obećanu zemlju, u taj novi svijet je zapravo postala jedna diskriminacija onih koji su očigledno bili nedovoljno dobri, odnosno nedovoljno u tom smislu i financijski i po nekim drugim vjerojatno čimbenicima poželjni da bi ušli u Sjedinjene Američke Države. I zato vjerojatno to iskustvo, dakle onih koji su iz potpaluba ulazili na Ellis Island, na te poznate stepenice Ellis Islanda, odnosno te prijemne zgrade, bilo poprilično traumatično i poprilično stresno.
What was the experience then on the Ellis Island when they saw the Statue of Liberty, probably happiness in a way, and then?
I think it was a very ambivalent experience. First of all, certainly happiness. Then, these were people who, most of them, never traveled very far before this trip. I assume that most of them experienced seasickness for 10 days, so probably had not eaten much. So they were certainly happy to be on solid ground again. But it was coupled with a high degree of anxiety. Will I pass the immigration controls? And around over time, but some 5% of people did not pass and were sent back, which was not a very happy experience. And then what will happen afterwards? They did have information, as I told, and they did have some expectations, and most of them had relatives who waited for them. But still, none of them spoke English. Many of them could not write and read, so it must really have been a huge experience and an adventure, but also coupled with some anxiety. And this is also what we get from the migrant letters.
Dakle, oni bi ulazili u jednu veliku prostoriju, vodili bi ih po tim famoznim stepenicama po kojima su čak, dakle, liječnici negdje sa strane već stajali, negdje ih onako pogledom zapravo dijagnosticirali, jer vremena zapravo za prihvat tako velikog broja ni nije previše bilo. Dakle, pogledom dijagnosticirali i onda čak pisali na odjeći, dakle, kredom nekakve oznake koje bi trebale značiti, dakle, da li će oni ići na neke daljne preglede ili da li će na neki lakši način zapravo ući unutra. Nakon toga su slijedili ono što se popularno zvalo dakle, medicinski pregledi u 6 sekundi, jer dakle, kad se izračunalo, shvatilo se da više od 6 sekundi liječnik nije imao za jednu osobu, gdje se dijagnosticiralo to nekakvo medicinsko stanje, a što je opet bilo zanimljivo, dakle, prvenstveno su se recimo na različite načine stigmatizirali doseljenici iz jugoistočne Evrope, jer su bili dakle, proglašeni nekim, odnosno populacijom koja je bila sklona, odnosno u kojoj je tada bila prevalentna trahoma, što po bilo kakvim medicinskim arhivima jednostavno nije bilo točno. Dakle, bilo je dovoljno da ste iz jugoistočne Evrope i da prolazite neke još zapravo strašnije, odnosno detaljnije preglede unutar same zgrade.
So they all came to New York. And what after that? Was it really the relatives who were waiting for them, or maybe there were already some agents who were...
Yeah. Both. Very, very soon after a significant number of migrants from any country arrived in the United States, they created their own associations, support associations, which were really important. And these associations also tried to, well, ease the entry into the United States and provided some help and support in New York. And then very often the migrants from Europe, they already had bought their railway ticket to their final destination in Europe. So this was part of the package that they bought from the travel agents, which included railway travel to a port, then the steamship ticket, and then also a ticket for railways in the US to Pittsburgh, to Cleveland, to Chicago.
I mean, steel industry in Pennsylvania and in Ohio, Indiana, even what you mentioned, Chicago, but they didn't have that kind of experience in Austria-Hungary, especially Croatian parts of,
Not at all, and of course they were employed on the on jobs that demanded the least skills, but they were physically very demanding. They usually were also the first ones to lose their job in times of crisis, so you see also very high mobility, many migrants. It took them some sort of intermediate stops to finally settle somewhere, and they had to be very mobile, coming from a farm and then entering a steel factory or a mine in America. This was the first experience of industrial labor, and often also the first experience to live in a city.
That was influencing their ideas and their political affiliations at that time, maybe not as similar as something that we experience after the Second World War, or we know from those who migrated after the Second World War.
In terms of political experience, those who in the first years, they did not care much about politics. They cared about survival and to save as much money as possible so they could send money back. But then those who settled, they became unionized. They often joined organizations of the workers' movement. And I think and also if you look at the newspapers that were produced, also in Croatian, many of them are left-leaning or socialist. So I think they cared more for their rights as workers than for their national identity. And this is, I think, a significant difference to the post-Second World War immigration. And this was also something that concerned the Habsburg and then also the interwar Yugoslav governments, because they saw, well, these people who might return, they come back as socialists and Republicans. So they really don't fit well in our political landscape.
Do 1914. u SAD-u je živjelo već više od 600.000 Hrvata. Najveći broj otišao je u industrijske i rudarske krajeve na istočnoj obali, a posebno u gradove poput Pittsburgha, Chicaga, Clevelanda, New Yorka, Buffala, Detroita i Milwaukeea. Samo je manji broj otišao na zapadnu obalu, tako da je u Kaliforniji početkom 20. stoljeća bilo samo 1% hrvatskih iseljenika. Isprva iseljenike dopadaju najteži fizički poslovi na velikim gradilištima, u kamenolomima i rudnicima. Dalmatinci i primorci u Kaliforniji najviše love ribu, obrađuju vinograde ili plove na trgovačkim brodovima. Za život hrvatskih iseljenika posebno je važno bilo osnivanje Hrvatske bratske zajednice 1894. godine u Pittsburghu. Ovo društvo osnovano je na inicijativu Zdravka V. Mužine, a željelo se dotad mala lokalna društva okupiti u jedinstvenu cjelinu kako bi se što bolje organizirala zajednica Hrvata u Americi. Osim niza kulturnih i društvenih inicijativa, Posebno su važne bile brojne humanitarne akcije, koje su pomogle tisućama Hrvata u SAD-u i u Kanadi, ali i mnogima u staroj domovini.
Činjenica je da Hrvati, dakle, kad i već uđu u tu obećanu zemlju, zapravo i dalje ostaju ono što se zapravo naziva stranim tijelom. Dakle, tehnološki termin je taj foreign body. Dakle, strano tijelo koje zapravo osjećamo kao nekakvu ugrozu, odnosno kao nekakvu opasnost za mainstream nacionalno tijelo, u tom smislu američkog tijela, i tu stigmu oni zapravo nisu nikad, ko ni mnoga strana tijela, dakle, u toj nekakvoj teoriji kolonijalne higijene, nisu nikad mogli zapravo zaobići, odnosno nisu je mogli nadići, naravno zbog činjenice da oni, pogotovo ta prva generacija, odnosno ako govorimo o tim prvim doseljenicima, bez ikakve društvene mreže koja bi ih na bilo koji način, dakle, uklopila u nekakve tokove drugačijeg oblika života, oni ostaju izuzetno siromašni, oni rade u izuzetno teškim uvjetima.
Croatian fraternal union is one of the most important of all fraternal organizations in the United States. And it was not only taking care of the Croats. There were other South Slavs who would also feel the need to maybe join and be helped by the Croatian fraternal organization.
Exactly, also the others. So the labels in their names do not necessarily describe the ethnic composition of the membership, though most of the members were Croats, but mainly also coming from Croatia. So that could also mean Serbs from the Kingdom of Croatia and Slovenia, obviously. And their main function was to provide support in a country, and this we have really to stress. The United States at that time basically did not have any welfare structures. So it was really a very sort of brutal society where you had to care for yourself, and this is why the immigrants so quickly created their own associations, which provided help in case of injuries, for example, or if a worker died, they would provide help for the family, and also, of course, they provided space for socializing, which was also very important, because these people did not have much money. They went also to the saloon, but only to a certain point, and then they also depended on these self-organized spaces for sociability.
Mit, odnosno ta ideja o tome da Hrvati su se izuzetno dobro snašli u Sjedinjenim Američkim Državama i generalno, dakle, tamo gdje god da su dijasporska zajednica, taj svoj nacionalni identitet da fantastično nose, ne stoji. Ostaju zatvorena zajednica, funkcioniraju međusobno, u stanju ste proživjeti 2 tjedna u Los Angelesu da ne progovorite englesku riječ, jednu engleskog jezika ako ste u hrvatskoj zajednici. To nije specifikum samo hrvatske dijasporske zajednice, to je česti slučaj, dakle, sa mnogim zapravo dijasporskim zajednicama koji dan danas funkcioniraju u tom nekom transnacionalnom identitetu.
You can talk about immigration in 19th century, in 20th century, in 21st century, you know. It's not a new field in historiography or in social sciences. But is it more relevant today in 2016, 2015, in the light of everything we are experiencing in Europe?
Of course, we tend to believe that it is more relevant. And this is some of the sort of paradoxes of history. On the one hand, history never repeats itself. On the other hand, there's not much new under the sun. And even there were also attempts to come up with calculations of pre-modern migration, and that shows that in terms of numbers there has not been probably much change over the centuries. Let's look back at the United States 100 years ago. So in the decade before World War I, the United States annually received about 1 million or even more migrants with the population of less than 100 million. So it was 1% or even more of the total population each year coming as migrants to the United States. Last year, I think we recorded 2-point-something million refugees to Europe, to the European Union, which has a population of 500 million. people. So if we compare these figures, then we might conclude that as unexpected and as significant last year's movement was, it should not be so difficult for a continent so rich and developed like the European Union with so strong institutions to accommodate it in a way that does not lead to building fences around the continent. And this is, I think, where migration history can help to debate about migration with less drama and to take a long-term view. And this is always a good. And this is the only thing that we historians can contribute to a meaningful public debate, to make the point that we always need to take a long-term view, and that what seems as something very significant today might seem less relevant in 5 years, or might seem much less dramatic in 5 or 10 years.
But in spite of everything, you even today have, even in the United States, politicians who talk about the need to build a wall and to protect the United States.
A wall and fence building is obviously very popular. So if I would invest money, probably in a fence building factory. But I think one thing that links nowadays debates and those a century ago in the United States, when you also had in view of these many immigrants from Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe, who by white Americans were not considered really white, and they were neither Protestant, they were not Anglo-Saxon, they were racially somewhere in between whites and non-whites. And I think one response to globalization is this urge to draw or to enforce borders, to draw new borders, to build fences. So this is one of the paradoxical aspects of globalization, that on the one hand you have this economic and social globalization that is ongoing, and on the other hand political forces that fall back on a very parochial nationalism, which everyone knows would not solve anything, but which obviously resonates with those many people who, for good or not so good reasons, fear globalization, because obviously globalization produces winners and losers, and this was in the 19th century pretty much as it is nowadays.
Maybe one of the conclusions could be that you could maybe fear globalization, but you cannot really avoid it. So immigrations and migrants will exist probably in the future in the bigger numbers.
It's clear that migration needs some sort of organization. We cannot just open the borders and say, well, everyone who wants to come to the European Union shall come. But at the moment, there's no migration policy at all. There's no something comparable to what Canada is doing or Australia. Certainly, I mean, the contexts are different. We are not an island, but still. But what migration policymakers have to have in mind is that many of their actions make life unnecessarily difficult for people who want nothing more than having a better life for themselves and for their children. And many of them will take to then so-called illegal means, risk their life to achieve something which would not be to the harm for us as an immigration society.
Dr. Brunnbauer, thank you very much for this conversation and explanations this night.
Thank you for the interest.
Thank you. Poštovani gledatelji, ovoliko o jednoj od najvažnijih gorućih tema u 2015. i 2016. godini, ali tema o kojoj možemo sa sličnim alatima govoriti i o 19. i o većem dijelu 20. stoljeća. Svi smo mi zapravo nacije imigranata. Hvala vam lijepa i laka vam noć.